Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Explore Everything. Today, we travel back in time to the year 1910, deep into the frozen wilderness of the Minnesota Northwoods, to uncover 7 survival tools lumberjacks built in the northern forests. This is a story of grit, cold steel, and pure human willpower. A world where survival wasn't guaranteed by gadgets or gear, but by what a man could create with his bare hands. The snow was deep, the air was razor sharp, and life depended on 7 tools, forged not in factories, but in fire, sweat, and desperation. In the harsh wilderness of 1910 Minnesota, there was no tool more sacred, more trusted, and more essential than the timber axe. To a lumberjack, the axe was life itself, the difference between a blazing fire and a frozen death. It wasn't just a tool of the trade, it was a symbol of power, skill, and survival. Every lumberjack carried one, and no two were ever quite the same. Each axe was customized by its owner. The handle carved from hickory or ash, the blade sharpened to a perfect curve, and the weight balanced just right so that each swing struck with precision. In the bitter cold, where the wind could freeze a man's beard solid within minutes, the axe became a constant companion. At dawn, when the forest was still wrapped in mist and silence, the first sound to echo across the trees was the thunk of steel biting wood. With each swing, men shaped their fates, cutting paths through endless timber, building shelters, and carving their mark into the wild. But beyond work, the axe was a survival tool, and when disaster struck, it often decided who lived and who didn't. Imagine a lumberjack trapped alone after a snowstorm. His food is gone, his fire dying. The temperature plummets below 40 degrees, and night falls fast. His axe becomes his salvation. He chops through frozen wood for fuel, builds a linde from fallen logs, and uses the back of the axe as a hammer to drive stakes into the ice. With skill and strength, he turns the forest itself into a fortress. The axe could cut firewood, split kindling, make snowshoes, or even craft a crude sled to carry supplies. It was the multi-tool of the Northwoods, simple in form, limitless in use. Every lumberjack had a ritual for caring for his axe. The blade was oiled and wrapped in leather to prevent rust. The handle was sanded smooth, treated with linseed oil to resist cracking in the cold. Some even gave their axes names. Betsy, Old Red, the Widowmaker. Losing one was like losing a friend. And in the camps, men could spend hours by the fire sharpening the blade, swapping stories of close calls. A tree falling the wrong way, a blizzard striking without warning, or a bear encounter in the dark. Through it all, the axe was their constant ally. When accidents happened, and they often did, the axe could save a life. A lumberjack pinned under a tree could chop his way free, or at least clear enough wood to keep from freezing. When wolves prowled near camp, the axe was the first line of defense. And when a man died in the forest, which was not uncommon, his axe was laid beside him, a silent tribute to the tool that had served him faithfully. Beyond survival, the axe represented something deeper, the bond between man and nature. It was a tool of destruction and creation. Every tree cut down could build a cabin, heat a meal, or forge a life. And yet, every swing reminded the men of how small they were against the vastness of the forest. The axe demanded respect, not just for the tool itself, but for the world it conquered. In the lumber camps of Minnesota, competitions were even held to see who could fell a tree fastest, split logs cleanest, or carve a perfect wedge. It was part pride, part necessity. A man's worth was measured by how well he handled his axe. Some could drop 100-foot pine exactly where they wanted, hitting a mark the size of a boot. Those were the masters, the legends of the timberlands. At night, when the howling wind rattled the walls of their bunkhouses and snow buried the camp roofs, the axe rested by the fire, blade gleaming in the dim light. It had earned its place. In those frozen woods, it wasn't gold or guns or gadgets that kept men alive. It was the humble timber axe, forged by hand, sharpened by skill, and powered by sheer determination. It stood as a testament to human resilience. The timber axe wasn't just the first of the 7 survival tools. It was the heart of them all. Every other creation, every sled, every cabin, every snowshoe, began with that one essential strike of steel on wood. In the cold silence of the northern forests, the echo of the axe was the sound of life itself. In the frozen wilderness of the early 1900s, one sound could slice through the wind and snow like a heartbeat. The steady shock of a crosscut saw, known among lumberjacks as The misery whip. This massive two-handed blade was the second most vital survival tool in the northern forests. It wasn't just an instrument of work. It was the bond that tied men together in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The crosscut saw was long, often 6 feet from tip to tip, with teeth sharpened like wolf fangs. Each tooth was angled to bite deep into the wood, then pull the sawdust out clean, leaving behind a smooth groove as 2 men worked in perfect rhythm. In those days, there were no chainsaws, no engines roaring through the trees. The only power came from muscle, timing, and trust. One man pushed, the other pulled. Back and forth, over and over. 1,000 strokes could bring down a single tree, each one echoing through the forest like a heartbeat of survival. Unlike the axe, which could be wielded by a lone man, the crosscut saw demanded unity. It taught patience, endurance, and cooperation. 2 lumberjacks, often called sawyers, would spend years perfecting their timing. They had to breathe together, move together, think together. A single mistake, a moment's hesitation, could jam the blade, snap a tooth, or even send the saw twisting dangerously. But when they moved as one, the blade sang. That haunting rhythm, shek, 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 became the sound of life in the Northwoods. Each saw was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. The steel was tempered to withstand the cold, flexible enough to bend with the grain, yet strong enough to rip through a century-old pine. The handles, called tiller grips, were often carved by hand, shaped perfectly to the calloused palms of the men who used them. And every team had its own tricks, gracing the teeth with animal fat to keep them from freezing, or rubbing pine tar on the handles for extra grip when frostbitten fingers grew numb. But the crosscut saw wasn't just for felling trees. It was a survival tool in every sense of the word. When blizzards trapped lumberjacks miles from camp, it could be used to cut firewood fast, or to split logs for makeshift walls. When trees fell across trails or rivers, it cleared paths for horses and sleds. In emergencies, men used it to carve out shelters in snowbanks or cut slabs of ice from frozen lakes for water. Some even used the blade's mirrored surface to reflect sunlight, a crude but effective signal for rescue. More than once, a saw saved lives. There are stories of lumberjacks trapped by fallen trees using a crosscut saw to free themselves or others. Even injured men, unable to swing an axe, could sit and saw. The motion slower, steadier, but still powerful enough to keep hope alive. And in those moments of silence between storms, when the forest stood still and the air hung heavy with frost, the sight of 2 men sawing together was almost poetic, a reminder that survival, in that brutal world, was never a solo act. Lumber camps often had competitions, not for fun, but for pride and survival. Teams would race to see who could cut through the biggest log in the shortest time. The winners weren't just faster. They were smoother, more synchronized. They worked like a machine. 2 men, 1 mind, 1 rhythm. When you saw them in motion, you understood why the crosscut saw was more than a tool. It was a partnership forged in sweat and cold. At the end of a long day, the saw was cleaned and filed by lamplight. Men would sit around the sharpening bench, using tiny triangular files to restore each tooth by hand. Every stroke of the file produced a faint metallic hiss, the whisper of survival being renewed for another day. The blade gleamed silver in the lantern glow, a reflection of the hard lives it sustained. In the dead of winter, when temperatures fell so low that breath turned to ice crystals midair, the crosscut saw kept the camps alive. It provided firewood, lumber for repairs, and even planks for makeshift bridges over frozen streams. Without it, the bunkhouses would have gone cold, the cookhouse empty, and the forest impassable. But perhaps the greatest power of the crosscut saw wasn't its ability to cut wood. It was its ability to connect people. In a place where silence and solitude could drive men to madness, the teamwork of sawing side by side gave them purpose. Every push and pull built trust. Every tree felled was a shared victory against the wilderness itself. They called it the misery whip because it punished those who fought against it. But for those who learned to move with it, to breathe in time with its rhythm, it became a friend, a lifeline, a reminder that even in a world of isolation and ice, survival depended not just on tools, but on one another. The crosscut saw wasn't only about cutting through timber. It was about cutting through loneliness, through fear, through the endless cold that could swallow a man whole. It carved not just wood, but courage, And in those endless forests of Minnesota, courage was the only thing that kept men alive. In the winter wilderness of 1910, where snow swallowed the trails and frost bit through wool and skin alike, one tool held a place of quiet reverence among the lumberjacks: the frost knife. It wasn't bought. It wasn't issued. It was made, forged by hand from broken steel, shaped by firelight, and sharpened against stone until it gleamed like frozen lightning. The frost knife was small enough to fit in a pocket, but in the deadly silence of the Northwoods, it could mean the difference between life and death. Every lumberjack had one, though no two were ever the same. These blades were born from scraps, broken saw teeth, discarded metal, or the jagged remnants of an old axe. When supplies were scarce and winters were long, men learned to craft their own knives out of necessity. Around the campfire, after a long day of cutting timber, they'd heat steel in the flames until it glowed red, hammering it flat on a makeshift anvil, often the back of an axe head or a chunk of rail. Sparks would leap into the night as they shaped the metal into a narrow, deadly edge. The handle might be wrapped in leather, birch bark, or even moose hide, whatever they had on hand. The result was a blade as rugged and reliable as the men who wielded it. The frost knife was more than a cutting tool. It was a companion. A man might not carry his saw or his sled when venturing into the woods, but he always carried his knife, hanging from his belt or tucked inside his boot. It was the first thing he reached for when trouble came. With it, he could split kindling for a fire, carve traps for rabbits, skin a deer, or cut through frozen rope. When frostbite set in and fingers went numb, the frost knife became an extension of the hand, simple, silent, and sure. There are stories whispered in logging camps of men who survived impossible nights with nothing but their knife. One tale tells of a lumberjack caught in a blizzard while hunting for food. His snowshoes broke, his matches froze, and his firewood was soaked. Using his frost knife, he carved dry shavings from the inside of a dead spruce and struck sparks from his axe head, coaxing a flame to life in the darkness. He built a shelter from pine boughs, wrapped his coat around his feet, and lived through the night, barely. When they found him the next morning, the knife was still in his hand, the blade blackened by smoke. In that world, the frost knife wasn't just for utility. It was a tool of creation and preservation. With it, a man could fashion nearly anything he needed: snowshoe frames, fishing spears, tent pegs, sled runners, even crude medical splints. When a man was injured in the woods, it was the frost knife that cut cloth for bandages and shaped branches into crutches. It was, quite literally, the forest doctor's scalpel. But the knife's edge had a darker side too. In the lonely vastness of the Northwoods, tempers ran short and isolation bred madness. There were fights in bunkhouses, feuds between rival crews, and tales of men who vanished into the trees, never to return. More than one frost knife was stained not just with sap, but with blood. It was a reminder that survival was not always against the elements. Sometimes it was against each other. Still, to most men, the knife symbolized resilience. Many lumberjacks decorated theirs with small carvings or initials, marks of pride, proof of ownership. A frost knife was deeply personal. It wasn't lent, traded, or sold. It was a man's signature, his fingerprint in steel. Some even believed their knife carried luck, that if it was lost, misfortune would follow. And so they guarded them fiercely, keeping them close even in sleep, the cold handle pressed against their chest like a heartbeat of survival. When food ran low, the frost knife became the tool of the hunter. It carved bowstrings, shaped arrows, and cut snares for hares. When storms buried the world in white, it trimmed branches for shelter poles and scraped snow from the bark to melt for drinking water. When the forest fell silent and death lingered in the cold, the frost knife whispered one thing: keep working, keep carving, keep fighting. Forged by necessity, tempered by struggle, the frost knife embodied the lumberjack spirit, self-reliant, unbreakable, and fiercely determined. It was the smallest of all their tools, yet perhaps the most powerful, because it represented everything that kept them alive: resourcefulness, patience, and the will to survive. In the biting cold of the Minnesota Northwoods, surrounded by ice, wolves, and endless miles of frozen timber, the frost knife was more than steel. It was faith in one's own hands. And in that merciless world, that faith was the sharpest edge of all. In the frozen silence of the northern forests, night was not just darkness. It was a living, breathing force. By sundown, the Minnesota woods of 1910 became a black sea of shadows where the wind moaned through the pines and snow whispered beneath the weight of unseen creatures. The temperature dropped so low that breath froze midair and the stars seemed to shimmer closer to Earth. In such nights, a man's worst enemy was not the wolves or the cold, it was the dark itself. And that was when the bark lantern was born, a handmade miracle of light, crafted from the living skin of the forest. Before electricity, before kerosene lamps or batteries, lumberjacks had to create their own light using whatever the woods provided. Birch bark, pine resin, moss, and sap. These became the ingredients of survival. The birch tree, known as the light of the forest, was the secret. Its bark, thin and papery, burned hot even when damp, fueled by natural oils that resisted the wet and cold. To the untrained eye, it was nothing special, just another layer of the tree. But to a lumberjack stranded in the wild, it was pure gold. A bark lantern began with a sheet of birch bark, carefully peeled from a living tree without killing it, a skill that took practice and respect. The bark was folded into a cone or cylinder, stitched with thin spruce roots or tied with strips of hide. Inside, pine resin or animal fat was packed tightly, sometimes mixed with dry moss or shredded bark as a wick. When lit, the lantern gave off a warm, flickering glow, soft enough to save fuel, bright enough to pierce the night. It wasn't just a tool of convenience. It was a weapon against despair. In those endless winters, when storms howled and days faded after only a few hours of light, the bark lantern was the only thing standing between a man and the suffocating blackness. Without it, the night became a trap. Every tree looked like a figure, every noise a threat. But with that small trembling flame, the darkness retreated just enough for courage to survive. A lumberjack might hang his lantern outside his shelter, its glow dancing across the snow like a living heartbeat. Others would carry it through the woods, the wind tugging at the flame as it flickered through the birch walls. It guided them home, marked trails, and served as a signal through the blizzards. One light in the distance could mean the difference between being lost forever and being found. There are stories of men who built entire lantern trails to guide others through storms, hanging bark lanterns every few hundred feet between camp and logging sites. The light shimmered through the snow like fireflies, each flame a promise of safety. Others used them in emergencies. When a man was injured deep in the forest, his comrades would light lanterns and hang them high on tree branches, creating a beacon for rescuers to follow. In that world, a small flame was more valuable than gold. The making of a bark lantern became an art, one passed down from older loggers to greenhorns. They learned how to peel bark cleanly without cracking it, how to dry resin without losing its stickiness, how to adjust the wick so the flame wouldn't smoke or die in the wind. And when supplies ran out, creativity took over. Some used animal bones as lamp bases, filling the hollow ends with resin and bark scraps. Others used hollowed-out knots of wood, turning nature's imperfections into glowing vessels of hope. But the bark lantern was more than just light. It was a companion. Men talked to it during long nights in the wilderness, staring into its flame as though it were a friend. The glow painted their faces in shades of gold and amber, softening the hard lines carved by cold and exhaustion. Around it, they told stories of home, of lost comrades, of better days. The firelight made those tales feel real, if only for a moment. Even the scent of a burning lantern carried memory. The sweet smoke of birch and resin reminded them of campfires, safety, and life. When snow piled high against the walls of their bunkhouse, and the wind screamed through the cracks, the bark lantern's steady light was a reminder that warmth and will could still exist in the heart of a frozen world. Yet, the lantern demanded care. A careless man could lose it in a gust of wind, or worse, start a fire in his shelter. So every spark was tended like a child, every flame protected by cupped hands and breath. In that world, flame was sacred, the very symbol of survival. When the nights stretched endlessly and morning refused to come, the bark lantern burned on. It guided lumberjacks through the blackest hours, through hunger, frostbite, and fear. It wasn't made of glass or metal or oil. It was made of the forest itself. That made it something deeper, something spiritual. The lumberjacks often said the birch tree gave light to the lost, and in many ways it did. Each bark lantern was a spark of defiance, a refusal to surrender to the cold and the dark. It said, I am still here. I am still alive. So, when the snow fell thick and silence swallowed the woods, and the only sound was the crackle of resin and the hiss of flame, that little lantern, fragile, handmade, flickering in the wind, became more than a survival tool. It became the very heart of the forest's human soul, the light that refused to die. The year was 1910. Winter had clenched the northern forests in its iron grip. Snow lay deep, 10 feet in some places, swallowing the trails, covering stumps, hiding dangers beneath a white silence. The temperature had dropped so low that trees themselves cracked like gunfire in the night. For a lumberjack in the Minnesota Northwoods, there was no greater enemy than snow that deep, unless he had the one tool that could turn it from a trap into a highway: the snowshoe frame. To the untrained eye, a snowshoe might seem simple, a bent wooden frame laced with rawhide. But to a lumberjack fighting for his life miles from camp, it was nothing short of a miracle. It allowed a man to walk where no horse could tread, to glide over drifts that could swallow a man whole. Without snowshoes, a single step could plunge him waist deep into powder, each movement a battle against exhaustion. But with them, he could walk, hunt, and travel with ease, floating over the snow as if walking on frozen clouds. In those early days, snowshoes weren't bought in stores. They were built by hand from the forest itself. A lumberjack would find a young ash or birch sapling, green, flexible, and strong. He'd heat it gently over a fire, bending it into a long oval or teardrop shape. The ends were joined and bound with rawhide, spruce root, or leather thongs. Then came the weaving, the true art of the snowshoe. Strips of animal sinew or rawhide were stretched across the frame, forming a tight web that could hold a man's weight evenly across the snow. The tighter the weave, the smoother the stride. Every pair was different, made for the man who wore them. Some were long and narrow for open country, others short and wide for deep woods. Lumberjacks learned the skill from the indigenous tribes who had mastered it generations before, the Ojibwe, the Cree, and the Algonquin, whose knowledge of the land was unmatched. From them, the loggers learned not just how to build snowshoes, but how to read snow itself, how to tell when it would bear weight, when it would swallow you, when it was about to turn to ice. For the lumberjacks, the snowshoe frame was not a luxury, it was survival. Imagine being stranded miles from camp, snow falling so thick you couldn't see your own breath. The trees were heavy with frost, your boots sinking with every step. Without snowshoes, each movement cost precious energy, each fall sapped heat from your body. But with snowshoes strapped to your feet, the world opened up again. You could travel 20 miles a day across drifts that would stop a horse. You could find shelter, reach the river, or follow a trail home. There's a story told of a crewman named Elias, who once became lost in a whiteout blizzard after a logging run. For 2 days he wandered, burning his last matches to stay warm. When the storm finally broke, he built a pair of snowshoes from green birch, bending the wood over the heat of his campfire and lacing it with strips of his own boot leather. With those crude snowshoes, he walked 30 miles through the snow and lived. The others said he walked on frozen air, and from that day, no lumberjack ever left camp without at least the knowledge of how to build his own. Snowshoes also played another vital role, carrying supplies. Men would strap bundles of food, tools, and even small sled parts across their backs, moving supplies between frozen camps. In rescue missions, they were indispensable. When a man went missing, the searchers always wore snowshoes, leaving a trail of oval prints behind them, stretching into the wilderness like a lifeline. At night, snowshoes were never left outside to freeze. They were hung near the fire, the rawhide webbing drying and tightening with the heat. If it was left out in the cold, the rawhide would stiffen and crack, and by morning they'd be useless. Lumberjacks took care of them the way soldiers cared for their rifles. Some even decorated them with carvings, initials, simple crosses, or forest symbols, believing the markings brought good luck on long journeys. The beauty of the snowshoe was its simplicity. It didn't need metal, engines, or fuel. All it required was wood, hide, and knowledge, and that made it the perfect survival tool. In a world where even horses could die from exhaustion in deep snow, the snowshoe gave man an advantage. It turned nature's greatest obstacle into his greatest ally. The act of walking on snowshoes was almost spiritual. Each step was silent, weightless. The world felt different from above the snow, brighter, cleaner, endless. Men described the sensation as walking on light. The forest, usually dark and menacing, seemed peaceful when seen from that height. The snowshoe gave them not only survival, but a rare moment of serenity, a way to move through the wilderness without breaking it. Still, it was a hard tool to master. A wrong step could tangle your feet and send you sprawling. Climbing hills was a battle, crossing ice a gamble. But once learned, the rhythm of snowshoe walking became second nature. The soft crunch of snow beneath, the hiss of wind above, the sound of life continuing against all odds. When the deep cold came and snow buried the world, the snowshoe frame was a gift of movement, freedom, and endurance. It wasn't the most dramatic tool, nor the deadliest, but perhaps the most poetic. It symbolized man's ability to adapt, to take what nature gave him and turn it into something that carried him forward. In the endless white silence of the northern forests, the snowshoe was more than a way to move. It was a promise that no matter how deep the snow, no matter how heavy the storm, the lumberjack could still keep walking, step by step, mile by mile, across the frozen clouds of a merciless land. In the heart of the northern wilderness, where the pines stretched for miles and the air burned with cold, so sharp it stung the lungs, the lumberjack's world depended on movement. Timber had to be dragged from the cutting grounds to the riverbanks, supplies had to reach the camps, and injured men had to be carried home across miles of snow and ice. In a place where no wagon could roll and no horse could gallop through waste, deep drifts, one invention made it all possible. The log sled, the silent freight train of the forest. The year was 1910, and deep in the Minnesota Northwoods, the log sled wasn't just a tool. It was a lifeline, built entirely by hand from the very trees it carried. It was a simple yet ingenious creation. Two long runners, often made from green birch or ash, curved upward at the front like the bow of a ship. Thick crossbeams joined them, lashed with rawhide or nailed tight with hand-forged spikes. Across this frame, men laid planks, logs, or bark to form the bed. The surface was greased with animal fat, pine tar, or even ice itself, anything to help it glide more easily across the snow. Once built, the sled transformed the way men worked and survived. Horses or oxen would be harnessed to the front, straining against their collars as the sled creaked forward, loaded with thousands of pounds of timber. When the animals weren't available, the lumberjacks themselves would take up the ropes, heaving and sliding the heavy load across the frozen ground with nothing but sheer willpower. The sled tracks carved deep scars into the forest, leading from the camps to the frozen rivers, where the logs were stockpiled for spring. Those trails were known as ice roads, and they were the arteries of the lumber world, built by hand, maintained by men who poured water over the snow to make it slicker and faster each night. But the log sled wasn't only for hauling wood. It was the workhorse of survival. When food ran low, it carried barrels of flour, salted pork, beans, and coffee through the storm. When men fell sick or broke a leg in the forest, it became a stretcher, the only way to bring them back alive. Wrapped in blankets and tied down tight, the injured rode the sled home through blizzards that could kill a man in an hour. The sled creaked and groaned as it slid over ice and snow, its wooden runners singing against the frozen ground, a haunting sound that echoed like the heartbeat of the forest itself. At night, when the day's work ended, the sleds rested beside the bunkhouses, their wood steaming faintly in the firelight. Men would gather around them to repair cracks or tighten lashings, their breath rising like smoke into the dark. A good sled could last an entire winter, but every man knew it might also be his only hope of escape if disaster struck. There's a story told among old loggers about a blizzard that hit the Pine County camps in January of 1910. The storm came suddenly, fierce and merciless. The wind howled like a living thing, and the temperature plunged faster than the men could react. A crew of 7 was trapped in the woods, 20 miles from camp. They had one log sled and 2 horses. The men tore the logs off, flipped the sled, and used it as a makeshift shelter, cutting pine boughs to cover it and lighting a fire beneath the curved front for warmth. For 2 days they stayed like that, huddled beneath the sled while snow piled higher and higher. When the storm cleared, they dug their way out and made it back alive. Their freight train had become a life raft in a sea of snow. The sled also became a symbol of ingenuity. When tools broke or supplies ran out, The log sled carried everything men needed to rebuild. It transported saws, axes, spare parts, and even sections of frozen river ice for water storage. During the coldest months, sled convoys would move through the woods like ghostly processions. The creak of wood, the snort of horses, and the rhythmic crunch of boots on snow marking their passage. At dawn, the sight of the first sleds emerging from the fog meant hope, food for the camp, warmth for the fires, and fuel for survival. Building a sled required skill and knowledge. The runners had to be perfectly curved to avoid digging into the snow. If bent too sharply, they'd break. Too shallow, and they'd drag. The best lumberjacks could shape them by eye alone, using their axes to shave smooth arcs from green logs. They'd test the sled by hand, running their fingers along the grain, listening to the wood like a craftsman listening for a heartbeat. A perfect sled glided silently. A bad one screamed. And yet even perfection couldn't always defeat the elements. The forest was ruthless. Sleds splintered on hidden stump, sank in soft snow, or vanished into frozen creeks. When that happened, the men rebuilt them, always from the same resource, the forest itself. Every tree felled gave something back: fire, food, shelter, or movement. The log sled was a reminder of that balance, a partnership between man and nature born from necessity. When spring came and the great thaw began, the sleds would be dismantled or left behind to rot into the ground. Their work was done. The rivers would soon carry the logs downstream to the mills, and the forest roads would vanish beneath mud and moss. But the memory of the sled endured, in the scars of the trails, in the muscle of the men who pulled them, and in the stories told around campfires long after the snow melted. The log sled wasn't glamorous. It didn't shine like steel or roar like engines that would come decades later. But in that world of cold silence and endless work, it was a symbol of endurance, a testament to the strength of men who refused to stand still. It turned the frozen wilderness into a living, moving world, a place where survival rolled on runners of wood, pulled by muscle and will. In the lonely expanse of the Northwoods, the sled was more than a machine. It was the pulse of the forest, slow, steady, unyielding. And as long as the log sleds moved, the camps lived. In the winter of 1910, deep in the heart of the Minnesota Northwoods, the forest could kill a man as quickly as any beast. The snow fell so thick it silenced everything. No birds, no wind, just the heavy stillness of white death pressing down. For the lumberjack, miles from camp, there was only one hope: when the storm turned deadly, build a shelter before the night closed in. And what he built wasn't a house. It was a fortress carved from the bones of the forest itself. The log cabin shelter was the final, most vital survival tool in a lumberjack's world. It was the difference between freezing in the dark and waking to another day of breath and light. The men of the northern woods didn't just cut trees. They knew how to command them. From axe stroke to ember, every log, every spark, every breath of smoke meant survival. When a storm rolled in and escape was impossible, a lumberjack turned the forest into his ally. He began with his axe, cutting down small pines or spruce no thicker than his thigh. His movements were steady, measured, never panicked. Each swing deliberate, each fall of the tree a heartbeat closer to life. With his saw, he trimmed the trunks, stripping the branches to use later for insulation. In less than an hour, he could have a dozen logs ready, their resin bleeding through the bark in the biting cold. The site was always chosen with care, near a rise or thick stand of trees to break the wind, and close enough to dry wood for fire. He'd clear the snow to bare earth, marking a rectangle no wider than his body stretched twice. Using his axe and hatchet, he'd notch each log at the ends, fitting them together like puzzle pieces. The old loggers called it saddle notching. No nails, no rope, just wood locking into wood, tight enough to seal out the wind. As the walls rose, the sound of the forest returned. The crack of splitting wood, the rasp of bark, the dull thud of logs landing atop each other. Within hours, a rough cabin stood, shoulder-high, solid, defiant. Over the top, he laid smaller poles crossed and packed with moss, pine needles, and snow, nature's insulation. It wasn't beautiful, but it was strong. Inside, the space was barely enough for one man to sit or lie down, but that was all he needed. He'd line the floor with pine boughs for warmth, the air thick with the sharp, clean scent of resin and sap. Then came the fire, always the fire. With his flint and steel, He'd strike until sparks caught the curls of birch bark he'd saved in his pocket. Birch was gold in the forest. Even when soaked, it burned. The tiny flame grew, licking at twigs, then sticks, then branches. Soon, the cabin filled with the glow of living fire, its light dancing on the log walls like the pulse of life itself. Outside, the wind screamed and snow pounded the roof, but inside it was warmth, it was safety. A fortress built with nothing but hands, axe, and will. Lumberjacks learned to build these shelters fast, sometimes in as little as 2 hours. It wasn't just a skill, it was a reflex, passed down from older men who'd learned the hard way what happened to those who hesitated. Many camps kept a shelter log tradition, a competition to see who could raise a watertight cabin the fastest. But in the wild, the only prize that mattered was survival. The log cabin was more than protection from cold. It was a symbol of man's defiance against nature's cruelty. Every notch told a story of endurance, every spark of flame a rebellion against the endless winter. And when the storm broke, when dawn came pale and silent over the snow, the man inside would step out into a world reborn. Steam rose from his breath, frost cracked beneath his boots, and behind him stood the cabin, proof that he had faced the forest and won. Many of those makeshift shelters still stood for years after the camps were gone, half sunken into moss and earth. Hunters, trappers, and wanderers would find them, rough walls blackened by smoke, fire pits filled with ash, a few iron nails rusted in the corners. They called them ghost cabins. But for those who built them, they were monuments to craft, courage, and the unbreakable will to live. Sometimes, a lumberjack would carve his initials into the doorpost before leaving. Just a few letters and a year: HW 1910, JP 1908, a silent message to whoever came next: I was here. I survived. To the men of the Northwoods, the log cabin shelter wasn't just wood and labor. It was identity. It was the embodiment of everything they stood for: strength, endurance, and mastery over the wild. In that frozen world where death could come quietly in the night, this cabin was proof that man could still carve warmth from ice, life from wilderness, and hope from despair. In every timber, there was the echo of the axe that cut it. In every wall, the heartbeat of the man who built it. And long after the forest reclaimed it, the spirit of the log cabin remained, a monument to those who refused to bow to the cold.